This entire series, obviously, is the celebration of the city's centennial. And what I sought to do with this is to look back to the year 1912. What Torrance had created was a visionary project. And I wondered if there was something in the atmosphere, in the environment in America at that time, that led not only him but others to have visionary experiences. That brought about this series of Torrance and the Significant Americans. What it begins with is trying to find some original material by the historic person that I'm looking to dramatize. And I first turned to the Torrance Historical Museum, which is where we're at today and where we're rehearsing, to see if they had any material on him. And Janet Payne, the executive director of the museum, brought out this incredible document, the unpublished autobiography of Jared Sidney Torrance from August 1916. This is a document that is more than 200 manuscript pages that he had prepared, really at the insistence of his second wife, to document the incredible life that he had lived.
I look at a man like Torrance. Now, we have his writing, and as an actor, it's all about the author's intent, you know. It's about them, it's not about me. So I'm trying to bring out their intent, and his writing points to a man who was fair. You know, he was very good at business and made lots of money and was good at making money, but he wanted to be fair. Reminds me a lot of my dad, you know. Taking care of the people that do good work for you. And that's a nice thing to play.
I'm the author of the book Historic Torrance that was published in 1986, the first photo-illustrated history of the city that included extensive information about Jared Sidney Torrance. He was actually a fabulous figure. He was interested in all sorts of economic development, basically. He was on something like 140 corporate boards in Southern California from the 1880s to the early 1920s. And before he started the city, he'd already been involved in creating the Pasadena Electric Company that became part of the Edison Company. He'd worked with Llewellyn Steel, Union Oil. He had cattle. He had water companies. He'd run the Mount Low Railroad up in Pasadena. He did a lot of things.
Jared Sidney Torrance, in his creation of the city of Torrance, had a visionary experience. Now, it wasn't unique, but it was very rare at that time to create a city from the ground up that had the vital components of industry, commerce, and residential just blossom in an undeveloped property. This past summer, when I was looking for information about Jared Sidney Torrance, and I'm sure many of you have already heard me say, but if you were to ask me at that time what I knew of Jared Sidney Torrance, it was so brief. He came from New York. He was in real estate. He lived in Pasadena. He got enough money together to do this deal out here. And then I had the honor of reading his unpublished autobiography that there's a copy at Torrance Historical Museum and one at Torrance Public Library. And what a transforming document this is. It's more than 200 pages, and it is laid out as a autobiography of his life through the various corporations and business deals that he was involved with during his lifetime. And I was just amazed at the fact that a single human being could be so involved in business and bring to life so many valuable resources, while at the same time being unconcerned with leaving his name on anything behind him. We'll get into that later. He's a magnificent man, and I would encourage each of you to seek out and read this autobiography of Jared Sidney Torrance. What you're going to experience tonight is this much of a life that is this big. I know it sounds like hyperbole, but when you read this document, you experience it yourself, you'll understand that you cannot hyperbolize this man. Everyone in the city of Torrance, anyone connected with the city of Torrance, can take pride in a relationship with this human being. Not only was he a successful business person, very, very capable, with whom he was what I refer to as a first call developer. If someone had an idea, the one person they called, the first person they called, was Jared Sidney Torrance to make the deal happen. But he was an honorable man. Throughout this autobiography, what you understand is a person who had values instilled in him at a very young age, and he lived those values every day of his life. And when he could not live those values any longer, he decided to withdraw from business, and has just left us the vital resources that constitute Southern California today. He was involved in energy, he was involved in utilities, he was involved in real estate, he was involved in, well, I think I may have already mentioned, heavy industry. We will have an opportunity, I hope, to speak with Mr. Torrance afterwards. And so we'll have a moment here, a little music, and the performance will begin. Thank you.
In my somewhat diverse and rather intensive business life in California, it has been my pleasure to assist in the development of natural resources in the Southwest, to create, build up, and conserve large interests. Success in these endeavors has afforded me much pleasure. My next great pleasure in business has been to make the capital investments of my personal friends and clients a source of profit to them. The more profit, the greater pleasure. It was natural and unavoidable in connection with some of the rather large endeavors which I have been identified, and where large sums of money were necessary, to solicit and secure the cooperation of these friends and clients. In every community also, there is a certain percentage of people who are helpless in business matters, and who properly seek the advice in the investment of their ample or meager funds from friends, or from someone whose reputation, experience, and calling suggests as a trustworthy advisor. When, therefore, in connection with one of these large enterprises, and where large sums of money have been secured, either directly by solicitation or indirectly through an advisory capacity, and success is finally in sight, the promoter takes deliberate advantage of advanced knowledge and seeks out and secures these investments from friends and clients to its decided advantage at the lowest possible figure. There are questions which a conscientious man involved in that promotion is prompted to ask himself. Among those, should he stay in the game? For me, the game began in Gowanda, New York. My father was a lawyer there. He was industrious, always kind, always ambitious, and he believed in cultivating the habit of industry in boys, and likewise by loading them with responsibility, teaching them self-reliance. The winter after my 6th birthday, I was made to care for and feed a flock of 100 sheep. And with a brother 1 year older that same fall and winter, I carried all of our firewood from the Cattaraugus Indian Reservation 4 or more miles away. I also cared for the pigs and the poultry. And as a young man, I excelled at penmanship. And on school vacations, and especially rainy days, I was sent to Father's law office to copy papers, typewriters then being unknown. I could write 10,000 words or 100 folios in a day. And partly because he had a partner, and partly because he wanted to instill the habit of thrift and saving in me, I was paid the regular sum of 2 cents per folio. My first personal investment came at about the age of 12 or 13. I bid on a house and a lot that was being sold under a mortgage foreclosure, and I paid $700 for it. My savings and a small loan helped secure the deal. I made improvements to the property and sold it at a good profit. A few years earlier, my father had been elected district attorney of Erie County. I would sometimes accompany him to Buffalo and transcribed the proceedings of the court cases in which he was prosecuting. It was a dark, dingy, ill-ventilated courtroom, and the long hours and arduous work cost my father his health, tuberculosis, and at a young age I lost 3 brothers to another respiratory disease, diphtheria. Why I, my only surviving brother and only sister survived, I do not know. I entered Yale and graduated 4 years later, without honors. But with the distinction of having passed every exam from entrance to exit. Upon graduation, I returned home and took over the management of Father's business. Shortly after the beginning of the year, I made the trip to Chicago to take up the study of law. Having spent my time in a legal atmosphere at home, I was pushed ahead quickly, and as a clerk, received an unusually liberal salary. I enjoyed my office work, but it was so burdensome that I had to do my reading at night. And by September, my own health was in jeopardy. So I took the offer of a wealthy family to go to Europe and tutor their young boys. And I was glad to get rid of the law. I found fighting out other people's quarrels very distasteful. Well, upon my return home a year later, I was anxious to get busy, so I purchased a tract of timber, 1,200 acres along the Allegheny River. Now, my father was anxious that I resume the law, but I felt I was more suited to business. It was more to my taste. And I contracted with 2 dependable, honest men to cut, manufacture, and sell the product and pay me an agreed percentage of the selling price. They to guarantee the sales. Shortly after that, the price of railroad ties doubled. The ties from a tract of 150 acres of second-growth chestnut, which I reserved, paid for the entire price of the land. In the outdoor life, I became strong. Well, for many winters, my father had been convalescing in Florida. One winter, however, he convalesced in Southern California. and upon his return in the spring gave such glowing accounts that that summer I made the trip to Southern California via the Canadian Pacific and coastal routes. I arrived in Pasadena on July 4th. I was not long to decide to divest my interests in the East and make Pasadena my future home. Within 3 months, I became a Californian. My early years here, I conducted the real estate business in Pasadena and surrounding areas. I later became president of the Pasadena Electric Light and Power Company. I later sold that company to a small franchise of the Edison Electrical Company, not without making substantial extensions keeping up with the growth of the city. And I took my share of the profit in company stock and later became its vice president. Well, in a short amount of time, I was introduced to Mr. Lyman Stewart, then president of the Union Oil Company. I was president of the Pasadena Oil Company, the Edison Oil Company. And our corporation had a leasehold of land connected to the Stearns Rancho of the Union Oil Company. And just before the end of our interview, I inquired of Mr. Stewart his opinion of our holdings. And his reply was, "I'm afraid, Mr. Torrance, you're a little too far north. And if you want to get into the oil business," he would set aside some time and be glad to tell me about the Union Oil Company. Well, his little too far north remark struck me very forcibly. And that idea grew into a conviction that if I wanted to get into the oil business, it was much wiser to join the oldest, most established, best equipped company in the state, rather than to branch out on my own into an industry where competition was great, knowledge was valuable, and in which I had had no experience. So I went back to Mr. Lyman Stewart, and he freely gave me a full account of the company's history and what he saw as its future management and growth. He was anxious to get rid of a man by the name of Thomas R. Bard, soon to be U.S. Senator from this state, and who was too conservative for the oil business. Well, Mr. Bard owned 1/3 interest of the Union Oil Company, and he was consistently blocking its wheels of progress. So I entered into negotiations with Mr. Bard, and with 2 associates acquired his 1/3 interest. The consideration paid was $800,000. And thus, an era of rapid expansion began for the Union Oil Company. They constructed new pipelines, constructed new tank steamers, increased the size of the refinery, increased their holdings of oil lands, entered into a systematic development of its territory. The capital stock increased and subsidiary corporations were formed. And they issued bonds guaranteed by the Union and were floated at an unusually high figure. To my knowledge, the bonds issued by that company were the first oil bonds issued in the United States. They were valued at $1 million and sold at $95. Well, one summer, the company sent its geologist to study and make a thorough report of the northern area of Santa Barbara County. After several months' work, the report came back that the company should immediately purchase outright 4,000 acres of the formerly Rancho La Purísima and secure an option on the remaining 13,000 acres. The geologist suggested that there was a large deposit there at a depth of about 2,500 feet. Well, the company moved quickly, and they did purchase outright 4,000 acres of the property and secured a 90-day option on the remaining acreage. A location was made. Our best drillers were sent with the tools, double and triplicate so that no delays would happen. And they were instructed to drill down to a depth of 2,500 feet in 60 days if such thing were possible. The option was short, but it was the best obtainable. Within 6 weeks of constant drilling, at 2310, the depth of 2310, the day shift at 6 p.m., upon removing the tools from the well, discovered oil at the bottom of the drill. They had cracked the formation. Well, the superintendent immediately told them to drop the tools to the bottom of the well, bank the fires, and cease drilling. The superintendent then jumped on a horse and rode to Lompoc so that he could call Mr. Stewart and report his findings over the telephone in coded language and receive his instructions. Well, it was about 3 a.m. the following morning. The superintendent got up enough steam to raise the tools from the well when he discovered there was oil to a depth of 1,200 feet. Without an oil stain, he immediately dropped the tools to the bottom of the well. They were not raised again for another 6 months. The company immediately exercised its option on the 1,300 acres of the La Purísima. It purchased 40,000 acres of the, what was that called? The Jesus Maria Rancho. 12,000 acres of the Santa Rita, and several acres in surrounding property. And all this cost about $1 million. Of course, we weren't farmers, so we sold off the agricultural rights to most of the land. But we kept the mineral and oil rights. It cost the company but little, and today it is enormously valuable. In my connection with the Union Oil Company, I was asked, as manager of its finance department, to set aside some funds to purchase waterfront real estate in San Francisco. Later, we purchased the same kind of real estate in Portland and Seattle. And as our business was expanding, it became obvious to us that we would have to abandon our lease at Terminal Island, San Pedro. And while we were in those discussions, the city of San Pedro, then independent of Los Angeles, advertised a lease for submerged and tidal lands in the greater harbor belonging to it for a term of 50 years. Well, these lands and easement were sought by Captain Randolph Minor and some of his associates. But upon my suggestion, one of the company officers inserted himself into the negotiations, with the result that the Union Oil Company became part of the deal, albeit in a minority interest. The United States government had practically completed the breakwater to a tune of $3 million, and that made it possible to reclaim much of the harbor for wharves, docks, and commercial purposes generally. Now, the area that was known as the Minor Fill was about 160 acres. We were the highest bidders for the leasehold, and shortly thereafter, the papers were jointly executed and delivered. We then obtained the proper permits from the War Department and legislative action, which allowed a municipality to lease submerged lands and confirm those leases theretofore granted. After that, we obtained wharf franchises from the city of San Pedro immediately before it merged with the city of Los Angeles by a shoestring strip of land, connecting those two cities together. Well, under the wharf franchise agreement, we had to start and finish construction within a certain period of time. So concrete piles were driven. Rock was laid in between. We dredged channels 300 and 400 feet wide, 35 feet deep by suction. We raised the reclaimed land above high tide by several feet by depositing that dredged material on top of it. Extensive fireproof warehouses were constructed, and the plant was open for operation. Shortly thereafter, the City of Los Angeles instituted court proceedings against our lease, saying it was illegal, and seeking to confiscate the land upon which we had spent hundreds of thousands of dollars. This was done at a time when public opinion against private corporations was at its extreme. It was an unwarranted, shameful attack on our lease, especially since under the terms of the lease, the vast benefits were accruing to the city, and the land would revert back to it after the term of 50 years. It clouded our title. The Union Oil Company could not sell construction bonds, yet under the wharf franchise agreements, the work had to continue. The merging of the City of Los Angeles with the City of San Pedro was done by acts and methods that, if done by an individual, would have been criminal. The City of Los Angeles proposed to spend $15 million if the voters of San Pedro would approve the merger. In an individual, that would have been rank bribery. But the bribe was successful. The city was spending its money, but with questionable wisdom. It had an extensive wharf and warehouse facility, and upon a recent inspection, I found it to be absolutely empty. While across the channel, the Union Oil Company's warehouses were completely filled with freight. When the Union Oil Company of California fully started as a commercial enterprise, it became obvious that we needed to build a machine and repair shop to keep our tools accurate and to secure future business. Consequently, a shop was built in Santa Paula, where it did its own work and some custom work. There was a really nice young man who was an employee there by the name of Edward Double. He proved himself loyal, steadfast, and an excellent mechanic. Well, not before too long, the company incorporated itself into the Union Oil Tool Company, and young Mr. Double acquired a stock interest and became manager of the plant. Well, business was growing pretty well. Not only did the Union Oil Tool Company have a large customer in the Union Oil Company, it serviced every oil company in Ventura County due to its excellent workmanship. And when the oil industry began to spread throughout other counties and the Union Oil Company began extensive business in the Los Angeles and Orange County fields, it became necessary to move the plant from Santa Paula to Los Angeles upon lands on Mateo Street that had been previously purchased by the company. Business grew with rapidity, and the industry began to spread across the state. And as it did, new companies were formed, and the demand for drilling tools increased as well. The Standard Oil Company, the Associated Oil Company, the principal competitors to the Union Oil Company were buying their tools from us. Excellent workmanship again secured those deals. Now, gradually, the Union Oil Tool Company began to develop an Eastern and foreign business in oil rigs, drilling tools, and specialties patented by Mr. Double. Now, in order to service and secure future business in the East and the foreign territories, the company purchased warehouses in West Chicago that were constructed for manufacturing purposes and supplied them with the necessary machinery. And from that point, they could ship goods to practically every oil field in the world. The rapid rise of Los Angeles real estate was the main cause of the inception of the undertaking to build an industrial center near the harbor of San Pedro, which subsequently was given the name Torrance. And the Union Tool Company was looking to expand, and it was suggested that they look for a new location where they could build a new modern plant with every labor-saving device possible and with all the modern machinery that was obtainable. The shop that was built on Mateo Street was on opposite sides, and it was built up piecemeal. It was inconvenient. It was obsolete. So I entered into negotiations with an attorney for the Dominguez family. They owned a large tract of land between Los Angeles and San Pedro. And this negotiation resulted in the purchase of 2,800 acres at a price of $980,000 from the Dominguez family estate. Later, the purchase of 700 more acres at a cost of $550,000 from one of the Dominguez heirs. Now, the Dominguez Land Company was incorporated, and it had a capital stock of $500,000, and I was made its president. Later, the Dominguez Land Corporation was organized, and I was made its president also. It had a capital stock of $2 million, and it issued bonds of 1.5, the proceeds of which practically paid the cost of the land. This latter corporation became the operating company. And we employed the noted landscape architect Frederick Law Olmsted of Boston to lay out the town site. The Union Tool Company took an interest and purchased 25 acres of land, upon which they built their present magnificent plant. Next, we entered into negotiations with the Pacific Electric Railway Company to build a railroad through the town site to service the industries that would soon be locating there. Also, in their contract, within 3 years, they were to remove their rail yards from Los Angeles and put them on our land, on 125 acres, which we gave them without further consideration. Now, next in order of importance was the Llewellyn Iron Works. In their contract, they were to purchase 15% of the company stock, 25 acres of our land, and they were to move their plant from Los Angeles to the Dominguez development here. Now, the rapid rise of Los Angeles real estate was not the only cause for the Dominguez development. After a decade of weakness, the Iron Workers Union was beginning to grow strong. And the steel and iron worker employers were conspiring to break the union. The publisher of the Los Angeles Times was leading an effort to drive the iron workers, in fact all unions, out of the city. Well, the unions in San Francisco were not to be dissuaded. Not when open shops were operating in Southern California, depressing wages and working conditions. And in response to local harsh measures taken by the Merchants and Manufacturers Association, some of which tread pretty hard upon the toes of the Constitution of the United States, the union bosses resorted to violent means. A bomb exploded in an alley behind the Times building, killing 21 and injuring 100 more. 2 months later, a bomb went off at the Llewellyn Iron Works, practically destroying their plant. And for the Llewellyn brothers, it seemed an opportune time to relocate. With the development, the Dominguez development, well underway, construction had began, and it had moved to a point where a sales campaign was started to sell residential and business lots and acreage. And they were moving ahead quite nicely, almost reaching $1 million, when a national financial panic set in and the campaign ended. In the summer, when the skies were beginning to clear, the awful European war burst forth, and business stagnation ensued again. In July of that summer, the Union Tool Company employed 500 men, had just completed an expansion of its machinery, and was ready to hire 300 more employees. 90 days later, the plant was practically shut down and employed less than 50 men. The Pacific Electric Railway Company prayed for an extension to build its plant. Of course it was granted. The same was granted to the Llewellyn Iron Works. Well, things have gradually improved since then. The Union Tool Company is in operation again, and they're employing over 400 people. The Llewellyn Iron Works is presently constructing their plant. The Pacific Electric Railway Company is slated to begin construction immediately. Real estate, however, is still stagnated, and sales are nil. We went ahead and built an additional 100 bungalows to service the families of the industry that was locating here. But it looks as if most of this property is going to have to be rented, as nobody is in any kind of a mood to purchase real estate in any form. There are a few stockholders behind this enterprise, and most of them are men of means. It is their expressed wish that everything in the first consideration be done right. Plans were carefully considered. The construction is to be of the most thorough character. Sewers, paved streets, public utilities were constructed in advance. Alleyways with power lines and water mains and gas mains were spread throughout the town site. Lands were set aside for parks, an athletic park. A civic center was designed. Upwards of 300,000 trees were planted along the streets and windbreaks. Land was also granted for the construction of public schools. Careful consideration was paid to the proper housing of the families of the factories locating here. And while the future cannot be predicted, it must prove a material success. The residents of Torrance will enjoy an environment of good morals, good health, and industrial welfare and prosperity. If everything returns to normal within a reasonable amount of time, and the wheels of Western progress begin to turn again, the public-spirited men behind this endeavor should reap a substantial financial reward. Which brings me back to my question. It matters not how much effort, time, responsibility goes into attaining a result or avoiding disaster. Profit and capital, if there is any, should go to where it rightfully belongs. Selfishness, it seems, is so fundamental in the commercial ideas of an individual that fairness and justice are overlooked or deliberately ignored. There are possessions in this world more valuable than that. So perhaps I have my answer. Perhaps it is time to get out of the game while I still have a name. They didn't call it Torrance for nothing. That brings me to something else. Mr. E.H. Lockwood, a real estate agent in Pasadena, came to my home one summer evening and told me he was authorized to sell the Lancashire Ranch at $50 per acre. Had he not been a reputable businessman, I would have thought there was some mistake about it. This property consisted of 47,000 acres in the San Fernando Valley and was worth at least 3 or 4 times that price. As I was leaving for New York City the following morning, I instructed Mr. Lockwood to present the matter to my associate in Los Angeles, Mr. James Adams. I then telephoned Mr. Adams and told him to secure the property at the price offered. I endeavored to impress upon him that this was the opportunity of a lifetime, worth millions. Mr. Lockwood presented the deal to Mr. Adams, who was primarily a bondman and had a strong dislike for real estate investment. But he did recognize it was a good deal. But being slow to act, General Harrison Gray Otis of the Los Angeles Times and 4 of his associates snatched the persimmon, and a veritable golden opportunity was lost. But I am a good loser.
Ladies and gentlemen, with your approval, perhaps I can entice Mr. Torrance to come out and take a few of your questions. Mr. Torrance. Henry, do any of you have any questions for Mr. Torrance this evening? Right here. Helen.
From your position now in the 21st century, are there any of your relatives, your progeny, or their progeny, that are still around in the area that you know of? That's an unfair question since we're only alive until...
Well, it's hard for me to say.
Oh.
My wife and 2 children were killed.
Oh.
My first wife. So,
I'm sorry.
I don't know. I did have a second wife.
Mm-hmm.
What has become of her, I'm not sure.
Ah.
When you're speaking prior to 1921, when Mr. Torrance passed away. So what years does this cover?
Well, this is around 1912 and earlier. I went to Chicago in 1887, I believe, around that time. So it was shortly after that I began my business career. So it was between that point and 1912, with the founding of the city of Torrance.
And how old was Mr. Torrance when he passed away?
That's a good question. I was dead, I don't know. Mr. Powers?
He was 69.
Thank you. 69.
Not bad.
I didn't go by age.
How did the city of Torrance happen to be named Torrance, and how did you feel about it?
Well, I didn't want it to be. My associates were very adamant that it should be named Torrance, and it took a while, but I acquiesced. I thought it should be named Dominguez, but I caved.
Any other questions? Yes.
Did you stay active in the company town of Torrance after 1912, up closer to the time you passed away? Were you alive when the company town became a city?
Yeah, you know, I tried to stay as active as I could in any business adventure. I just enjoyed business, you know? I was in many, many different industries, and I just enjoyed the deal, and I enjoyed a good deal. The thing that made me get out of it were people who weren't up and up. People who were doing shady deals. That's why we left Los Angeles. You know, it was the way they operated. We just couldn't have that, so we started our own city. Purchased the land and we created it ourselves. Get rid of Los Angeles. We didn't need them, and they were interfering anyway. So I tried to stay as active as I could in as many business deals as possible. I just wasn't going to deal with anybody who...
Many of us still don't want to have too much to do with Los Angeles.
Interesting.
When you were looking for land and you decided on the land we call Torrance today, did you ever think about getting something toward the beach too?
Isn't there a Torrance Beach?
Yes.
Oh, you wanted to be right on the water.
Yes.
Well, you know what? This was a great area for the size of the plants that needed to be built. Also, it was a little closer to the harbor of San Pedro. We couldn't have San Pedro, we couldn't have Los Angeles because of Los Angeles. So we got as close as we could. And you know, that's why we had the railway come in, so that we could make sure that we could transport everything we needed. I don't know, it might have been okay near the beach, but it just seemed more suited for this area.
Can you tell us a little bit about your vision to bring Torrance Memorial Hospital to the community? I understand that your wife was able to pursue that dream before your passing. Do you have any words of wisdom about your vision for that hospital in the city of Torrance?
Well, Mrs. Torrance, you can tell us yourself about it.
Go ahead, honey.
Your hiring of Irving Gill to do the railroad bridge and the depot must have met with great approval. But how did you feel basically when the people responded so negatively to the first and only 10 homes that he built, where you all had wanted him to build 100? I know the public didn't like the simple homes, and you being a Pasadena man in that big beautiful home, Rose Hedge with Helena, how did you feel about...
You're talking about the concrete pouring?
Well, basically the simple houses, and were you surprised that the workers didn't embrace that?
Well, my wife died. So I wasn't necessarily thinking about the female perspective when building a simple house like that and what it might feel like to walk into. You don't want to walk into concrete, I guess. And so, you know, you try something, hey, it might fail, you move on, you do something else. As I said, I'm a good loser. I'm okay. We did end up building different types of homes, and they were successful. So, you know, it's one of those things. You have many, many ideas. You try them. Some succeed, some don't. The trick is to keep moving.
One more question here.
Yes, your vision for Torrance, if you could project yourself 100 years into the future to Torrance of 2012, what is one thing you would want to say to the people living in Torrance in 2012 about yourself and your vision?
Well, I'd like them to know that we started this to do something right, to do something correct, to do something that was not Los Angeles, to build a community that provided good health, good morals, and industrial welfare and prosperity. You know, there are parks and playgrounds and schools, and hopefully things are running correctly. Yes.
We're going to have a wonderful reception here. Please take a moment to share your stories about Torrance with one another. Thank you so much for being with us.
Well, I thought the play was effectively presented. I thought it was very educational. Learned a bit about Torrance history that I certainly wasn't aware of. Certainly from the perspective of understanding better who Mr. Torrance was, what his background was about, and what he had as a vision for the city of Torrance, and the way it's developed over the years. And I think it's especially significant that we get to have this opportunity during our centennial year.
The Works in Progress is a great resource for like school kids even. I wish this could be, you know, played at a time when they could see this, because, you know, it's living history that is being enacted here. And I think I'm looking forward to the rest of the series, because I think that John Powers has found a great way to celebrate our centennial.
Yeah, I learned a lot about Sidney Torrance and a lot about the history, and it was an interesting experience.
I thought I was rocked some ID. I didn't remember about the website for you as well, and I'm sure you have it done in the past with others, so you can have an idea of options.
Well, that's one thing that drew me to this, the 100-year anniversary of Torrance. Since I am a resident of the South Bay now, it's really nice to have a history lesson about it and to create kind of a connection to it by being able to play Jared Sidney Torrance. Also, what I've found so far in meeting some people as we've gone through this process is people are really excited about it. They're very happy and glad that somebody is presenting this, you know, and John does a great service here by doing all of these works, creating living history essentially for the people of Torrance. And this is probably a little more special because it directly relates to where everybody lives.
Yeah. Okay, so
here's Torrance Boulevard.